Hello class, today we're going to talk about observational and survey research. We're going to move from talking about general issues with research like validity in the research process and sampling to going into specific ways of conducting research and some of the pros and cons of doing research these ways and some of the major issues that we might encounter. So we're going to talk about observational research first, and then we're going to move in and talk about survey research. For observational research, we can break down into three different kinds of observational research. We can look at laboratory observation. This is where we have a subject come to a laboratory for data collection, and we put them in a certain situation. Typically, we're going to have a decent amount of control over the situation that the subject is going to experience. All right, so we might design a play environment, maybe for a kid, and see how they interact with the toys that we have with the specific play environment, but we can kind of control the situation that they're in. They're not out and about in the world. Another example is participant observation. This is where we're doing an observational study in which the observer, the researcher, is actually interacting with the subjects, okay, interacts with the people, the participants that are being observed. Okay. And lastly, we have naturalistic observation. This is where the researcher goes out into an organism's natural environment. This could be research in chimpanzees in sub-Saharan Africa. This could be studying human beings in the mall. All right, you go to individuals in their environment, and we record information about these individuals as they occur in their natural setting. So let's go into these in a little bit more detail. Okay, laboratory observation. Again, we bring our subjects to a laboratory setting. The great thing about this is we have good internal validity. Okay, internal validity, we have good control over the study. We know what the subject is going to experience because we are creating that experience for them. All right. So we have good internal validity. We know what the subjects are going to be exposed to. I mean, think about a study of conformity, and we're trying to see how people might react in a certain situation where everybody agrees on one particular outcome. Now, we can kind of control what everybody else is doing on a laboratory observation, so we can see specifically how that one individual acts. All right. So good internal validity, we can control the situation that the subjects are in. The only bad thing about laboratory observation is a lot of times the situations are contrived, that they are not likely to occur in the real world. All right, so we have bad external validity, specifically bad ecological validity. The lab environment is not very similar to a real world situation. And subjects know when they come to a laboratory observation that they're going to be studied. So this might change how they behave. All right. When participants realize that they're being studied, they typically going to change their behavior in some way. They might conform to what the experimenter or researcher wants them to do. Okay, they might guess, okay, well, I think that you guys are studying this, so I think I should act this one particular way. You'd be surprised as to how often that happens in a research study. So you have people either reacting, trying to help out the researcher, or maybe trying to hurt the researcher. But we want people to, if we're trying to get at truth, we want people to behave like they would in the natural world. But a lot of times with laboratory observation, these situations are contrived, and so they're not similar to what people are encountering in the real world. But many things that we can do in laboratory observation, we can do in a different way. We can study things with laboratory observation that we couldn't study in the real world, okay, or would happen very, very infrequently. Like let's say that someone passes out and is having a heart attack. What do people do? Do they try to help? Do they try to call 911? It's hard to study this in the real world because that happens relatively infrequent, right? And if you are a researcher, it'd be hard to be around when that does occur. But you can get somebody to fake a heart attack in a lab and see how people react and get a pretty decent sample size. All right. Again, psychologists tend to lie for some of the research studies, especially if we're getting into things like social psychology. Lying is part of the game. We'll talk about the ethics of that a little bit later. But some things that would be really difficult to study out in the natural environment, we can bring into the lab and study them. So that's an added benefit of laboratory observation as well. Okay, and as I mentioned before, since subjects know that they are part of an observational study, they know if they are going to a lab that somebody is observing their behavior, they're likely to behave differently. Participant observation. All right, here the researcher is interacting with the subjects of interest. So here's the distinction between participant observation. Maybe we're looking at how children are playing, and the researcher is playing with the children. All right, they are getting to know the children. They're getting to know their subjects. All right, compared to non-participant observation, here we have somebody that is a researcher that's observing children play, but is not a part of it, okay, and doesn't want to be a part of it. So one negative thing about this is we typically do not have good internal validity if we have participant observation. Okay, typically we're doing this outside of the laboratory environment, and this is going to make the behavior more natural, right? It's going to be more ecologically valid. It's going to have perhaps better external validity, but we might not be able to control the situation as well as if it were to occur in a laboratory setting. All right. Another problem with this kind of observation, participant observation, is that the researcher might cause certain behaviors to occur. All right. The fact that the subjects know that the researcher might lead the researcher either intentionally or unintentionally to change how the subjects are interacting, okay, or how the subjects are behaving. All right, even when the researcher is coding behavior, so researcher is determining whether or not that child played aggressively or not. Well, since the researcher knows these subjects, okay, and has good experiences with them, they might be biased in how they code a certain behavior because they know the subject. Oh, well, Ted would never do that. Ted's always a good person. And that one time that has to be like a random slap. That clearly wasn't like an aggressive slap. All right. So we can have many types of participant observation. I mean, we might go to a playground and interact with the children there and see how they play, how they behave, something about the social and cognitive development of children, all right? But you can kind of predict if you just show up randomly at a playground, this might be frowned upon. So you have to be cautious about that. Here's another good example of a sociologist, Rebecca Nathan, who, in order to kind of understand what college students go through in their first year of college, she decided to experience this herself. So she went to the dorms, pretended to be a student. I mean, obviously they knew that she was older than everybody else, but had a similar experience as all the other students and observed them in their natural habitat to see what college freshmen were actually like, what are the problems that they encounter, what is life like for them. If you were to ask this question as a professor, you're probably not going to get as accurate of an answer, right? Because they're like, okay, well, you're my professor. I don't know if I want to be honest about the kind of problems that are occurring. Maybe I don't want to be honest about how often I study for a test. But if you are at the same level as your participants, interacting with them, maybe you can gain some more insight. So this is a very interesting book about Rebecca Nathan spending a year as a freshman college student. All right, woo. Naturalistic observation. So this is where the researcher collects data and on the subjects in their natural environment. And the great thing about this is this has very good ecological validity. All right, we're seeing participants as they would typically behave in the real world. Another added benefit is we might be able to conceal our presence from these individuals. All right. But the problem that we encounter is we don't have a lot of control over the situation if we go out into the real world. All right. We don't have control over what's going to happen that day. All right. Maybe you show up to a playground and it starts raining. All right. You can control for that. You can't control for how many children are going to be on that playground. all right? So you don't have nearly as much control in a naturalistic observation as you would on an internal observation. And that's a good example of this. Jane Goodall and her research with chimpanzees, who was able to befriend a group of chimpanzees and observe them in their natural habitat. If you were to observe chimpanzees in a lab environment or a zoo environment, they behave very, very differently in captivity than they do out in their natural environment. And you would come to many incorrect assumptions about chimpanzees and their cognitive behavior if you were to look at them in captivity. So there's a lot of very important findings that Jane Goodall was able to observe with chimpanzees in their natural environment. Two things in particular, the use of tools. So chimpanzees taking sticks and stones and using sticks to feed on ants, sticking them in like an ant pile, stones to smash open nuts and things like that. Tool usage and the creation of tools that wasn't observed up until this point in time. Another thing, a little bit on the, tool making is a fun thing, but chimpanzees going to other tribes of chimpanzees and murdering them all, chimpanzee war, okay? Something that people didn't really know about until Jane Goodall's research with chimpanzees, all right? Another good example of this is Robert Sapolsky. Sapolsky, I believe, is still at Stanford, but every summer, instead of, teaching summer classes or that sort of thing, Robert Sapolsky goes back to the same baboon troop and observes them in their natural habitat. Sapolsky's very interested in things like hormone and health psychology and the impact of social stress that on the body. So looking at baboons and baboon social hierarchies is very interesting for him. So he is part baboon, or has been accepted by this baboon troop, which is pretty interesting. This doesn't just have to deal with primates, although some of the primate research is very, very interesting. You could do the same thing by going to a mall, right? You guys still go to malls, right? Probably not as frequently, but this was very, very big, especially when I was growing up. This was the place to be if you were in high school. And so if you want to observe what human beings typically talk about, how they typically interact with one another, maybe you sit down in the food court and you look around you. All right, this is always a good demonstration to do, to go people watching, see what other people do, see how they interact. And again, if people don't know that they're being observed, they're likely to behave in ways that they would not behave if they were in a laboratory. Okay. 1 second. Okay, now let's talk about the difference between concealed and non-concealed observation. And this is always a decision that you have to make. There are many advantages to concealed observation. So this is where we don't reveal our presence to our subjects, and the subjects never know that we are studying them. Now, the great thing about this is, well, if subjects don't know that they're being studied, well, then they're likely to behave the same way that they typically behave. And so our data is probably of higher quality than if we were to say, hey, just to let you know, I'm going to be observing you and writing down everything that you do in my notebook. Is this cool with you? It's likely to change how people interact, right? It's likely to change how people deal with things. I mean, think about things like reality TV shows, things like The Bachelorette, more my generation, Jersey Shore. As soon as you tell individuals that they're being observed, they act in a very different way, okay? On these reality TV shows, to become famous and things, they might act more outrageous than they typically would. All right, so why is it the case that we don't always use concealed observation? Well, there are some ethical concerns with using concealed observation, right? Think about if I were to observe you at like a bar or a setting or a club or something like that. You probably don't want somebody observing you and writing things down of what you're doing, right? That would be kind of an invasion of your privacy. So sometimes we don't do this for ethical reasons. I mean, only in situations where being concealed is necessary for the research design do we do that. Do we waive the rights of subjects to consent to be part of the research study. Okay, so concealed versus non-concealed, there's advantages for concealed, but there's ethical concerns if we conceal ourselves from our subjects as well. So maybe we might go for a non-concealed observation, right? So bring the person to a laboratory, let them know what we're exactly looking at. This is easier to do in situations like with children. All right, you might tell the parents, and the parents consent on the children being observed, and that way the children don't really know what's going on, but you do, and they act naturally. So again, why would researchers not always conceal their presence? There are some ethical problems with concealing your presence. Okay. Researchers have to justify to the institutional review board that the observation has to be concealed. The researcher has to make an argument that concealed observation is necessary for the research to be carried out, and the research is important enough that it has to be carried out. Okay, like I mentioned, if we're examining somebody at a bar and looking at flirting behavior or something like that, that might be something that people are squeamish and uncomfortable having someone just observe their behavior in that situation, and they would prefer that you let them know if you're planning on observing this behavior, even if they're in a public setting. Okay, so those are just concerns that we have to have as researchers. Okay, with observational studies, what behaviors are we looking at? Okay, what behaviors are we looking at? How are we answering our research question? We have to come up with a coding system of what behaviors we're interested in and how we record those particular instances. All right, so a good example of this is when I was an undergrad, there was a daycare center attached to the university, and it was specifically for professors' children. So, you know, there might be like 8 or 10 children there a day. And a great thing is that since it was the university child center, we were able to, for our developmental psychology class, to go over there and do observational studies with the children. And let's say, and this is actually one of the things that I did for my developmental psychology project. We looked at the difference between how little boys and little girls play on the playground. Okay, who plays more aggressively? Is it little boys or is it little girls? But remember, if we're interested in something like a hypothetical construct as aggression, how do we operationally define aggression, right? How are we going to find some behaviors that we're going to consider aggression, all right? Do we count people pushing one another? Do we count children yelling at one another? All right, we have to have some way of recording if, let's say, we want to see if there's a difference between little boys and little girls and how they play aggressively and whether or not they play aggressively. So we need to think about what behaviors we're specifically looking at and what we're going to count as an instance of aggression. Okay, so we need to be concerned with these operational definitions. Think about this one. Do strict or lenient boss managers lead to more counterproductive work behaviors? How are we going to measure counterproductive work behaviors? What do we count as a counterproductive work behavior? Does surfing Facebook or looking at Facebook count as a counterproductive work behavior? Well, maybe, but maybe they're doing it to find out the email address or something of somebody that they're working with. Okay, is listening to music a counterproductive work behavior? Sometimes music might help somebody get something done more quickly if they have some menial task, right? But if you're like listening to music and have your foot up on the desk, that probably is more of a counterproductive work behavior. But we have to clearly define for anybody observing, this is the behavior of interest in how we mark it down on our coding sheet, all right? So these operational definitions are very important, okay? Does alcohol increase flirting behavior at a bar? Okay, this is maybe another good instance of an observational study. What do we count as flirting behavior? All right, typically when I give this lecture in class, I say, well, does winking count as flirting behavior? Are we going to say that's, or maybe, you know, that somebody has something in their eye? I said that, and one time a student was like, no, winking's just creepy. It's not flirting behavior. I'm like, okay, I can understand that. So what do we count as flirting behavior? Is it like the twirling of the hair? Is it winking in someone's general direction? Is it getting closer to somebody? How are we going to, as a researcher, determine what we call flirting behavior and what we don't call flirting behavior? So we need to come up with a coding system. So operational definitions are going to be critically important for developing a way to answer these research questions. Okay, what is a coding system? A coding system is a set of rules to help guide how the researcher classifies and records behavior under investigation. All right, does throwing a ball at another kid's face count as an aggressive act? So in fact, when I was doing this study in developmental psychology, I had, you know, two kids passed a ball with one another, and one of them randomly throws the ball at somebody else. It's like, well, they hit the other kid in the face with the ball, but that wasn't necessarily intentional. Now, do I count that as something, an element of aggression? I had not anticipated that this behavior would occur, right? And so now you have to sort of classify, is this behavior aggressive? Is it not aggressive? We need to have a good coding system that has clear rules as to how we're going to collect our data, what we're going to call aggression and what we're going to call not aggression. Right. How about listening to music? Is that a counterproductive work behavior? Well, like I said before, maybe, like for instance, when I'm doing data analysis, I'm using statistics, I listen to music. And I wouldn't necessarily say that it helps me get things done. It makes it more bearable, definitely. But I don't think it impacts the productivity. Okay, so we need to classify this, to have some kind of classification system. How about checking the news every so often? Is that counterproductive in work? Maybe that's expected for your work. Maybe you work at a news company and checking the news is something very important for you. Okay, perhaps you work for a political campaign, then checking the news would be very important as well. So how do we classify these behaviors? How do we operationally define what we're interested in? Very important. What counts as flirting? We need an operational definition of this. Laughing obnoxiously at jokes that are not funny, winking, bragging about yourself. How are we going to classify this behavior? What are we going to classify as flirting in this particular situation? There's three different kinds of recording that we can do in an observational study. One is duration recording. So let's say that we're doing an observational study over one person for an hour. Duration recording is the amount of time that the individual spends in doing this behavior. All right. So over the period of 1 hour, how often does the person actually do their job or spend the time goofing off? So that might be an example of duration recording. We're looking at children playing. How often do children play with other children or by themselves? We might do a duration recording of that and have an estimate of time of how often the child plays by themselves on a certain day. Another way of recording is frequency count recording. Here we're tallying up however many behaviors we see. So for instance, we can look at aggressive actions. We see how often a kid aggresses upon another kid. Okay, how many times does a kid smack another kid in the face? We just have tally marks, right? Frequency, how many instances of that behavior occur. Kind of a combination of these two is interval recording. Here we set up pre-planned intervals and we mark whether or not the behavior occurred in that interval. So let's say that we're recording children for an hour and we break it down into an hour. That would be 12 increments of 5 minutes. And we are recording whether or not a behavior occurs in those 5-minute increments. So we see whether or not an aggressive action occurred in the first 5 minutes, yes or no. Second 5 minutes, yes or no. So it's a combination of both frequency and duration. All right, we're seeing if these behaviors are occurring in all of these different intervals of time. Okay, another important thing for observational studies is to determine how you're going to pick who you observe, and when you are going to do your observing. Okay, so you might create an observational schedule. This is where researchers determine, okay, when and where are we going to do the observing? All right, are we going to examine one person for the entire period? Are we going to switch people? How are we going to determine who it is that we observe? All right, which location do we end up using for our observational study? Are we just going to use one location? We're going to use many different locations. Let's say that we're interested in dog owner behavior. Do we go to one dog park? Do we go to different dog parks? What do we do? Okay, that's going to be in our observational schedule. How do you select subjects? Do we pay attention to one person? Do we try to pay attention to everybody that's at that dog park? That's going to be pretty difficult. We might miss something. Maybe it's the case that every 15 minutes we switch who we're examining. All right, maybe that's something that we do. All that's going to be in the observational schedule. Okay, do we try to record behavior from one subject or from a group? Like I said, one subject we can probably pay attention to. If we have looking at a group of subjects, we get more data, but we might be missing out on things because we can't attend to everything at the same time. A great thing to do when you're determining your observational schedule, when you're determining your coding system, is to do a pilot test. A pilot test is running through the study before you're collecting any real data, working out any of the kinks, okay? So maybe it's the case that one dog park that you go to is not very good, not very many people go to it, right? Might be good to do some pilot testing to determine what location is the best. Maybe it's the case that you think that you can observe multiple children at the same time, and then you do your pilot test and you determine you can't. It's too difficult. They're all running around all over the place, right? Just won't work. So maybe you decide to go with a different approach. It's important for all research studies in psychology, well, pretty much all research studies, to go through a pilot test before you actually conduct the study itself, right? There's plenty of things that you might change about the study that you didn't even realize until you actually start going through the study. A great example of this is like the developmental psychology class that I had where we were observing children and whether or not they were behaving aggressively. There's some things that you might count as aggression that you did not realize occur until you were actually observing children, right? So maybe it's the case that children are like aggressively playing tag and you didn't think that that was aggression in the beginning, but you might want to change how you code that behavior. So maybe to work out the particulars of your coding sheet, how you code certain behaviors, you want to do a pilot test, all right? Working out the kinks of your study. Yeah, pilot testing is a very good thing to do. You'd be surprised as to how your research can go wrong if you don't go through a couple of subjects to begin with to see what works and what doesn't work with your research study. All right. Should we train our observers before beginning a research study? All right, should you, the observers, should we train them? Most of the time, yes. Okay, you want to train them so that they are all on the same page. A very important form of reliability is inter-rater reliability, so that if the raters rated the same behavior, that they would all come up with the same scoring criteria. And to make sure that we have good reliability, sometimes we might video record a session, video record our subjects, and then have this different raters rate the topic of interest, and we see if they all have similar scores. We see if they all use our coding sheet similarly. If they don't, we have problems with the reliability of our observations. So again, we want to have good inter-rater reliability for our observational studies, so it's good to train our observers to make sure that they're all attending to the same thing, that they're all rating things in a similar way before we begin the study. Okay, and again, sometimes what we might do is we might get multiple raters to rate the same event. We might video record our study, our observational study, and we get multiple people to rate things to make sure that everybody has a consistent scoring metric and that our results are not just due to one rogue person grading things or scoring things vastly different than everybody else. Okay. Another advantage, another important aspect of observational research, we might want to make sure that the observer, the person that's coding behavior, doesn't know what the goal of the research study is. We might make sure that the observer doesn't know what condition maybe our subjects are in. Okay, we might make them blind to the purpose of the study. We might make them blind to, if let's say we have different conditions in our study. This way that their expectation of what should happen with the data will not cloud and influence their recording of the behaviors. All right. So that's it for observational research. We'll start survey research in the next video. Thank you guys, and I'll see you in the next video.